Hi everybody, and welcome to Module 10. Today we're going to talk about the trouble we're in, looking at pandemics, but also economic crashes, and also the political uses of concepts of apocalypse that have been used all throughout time, but also today in our current political environment. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, the three things we're going to talk about, as mentioned: disease as apocalypse, the political attraction of apocalypse in turbulent times, but also the fear of economic collapse. And there's a couple more videos that will follow on this, which will kind of get into this concept as well. But let's just start in with disease as apocalypse. As most everybody here knows, of course, we're dealing with the COVID pandemic still here in the last parts of 2022, or the middle parts of 2022. But when this started in 2020, of course, there was a lot of concern at this was going to be a real potential sort of, defining moment and potentially an apocalyptic moment in world history. And of course, in 2021, the pandemic actually got worse in terms of numbers of victims. And in 2022, it got worse even still more. And so as of June of 2022, if you see, here on the data over there, basically what it says is that we've got about 6.3 million deaths so far from the COVID pandemic. Now, if we look at this in historical context, of course, there have been pandemics in the world about every 100 years or so, and the COVID pandemic is not unsubstantial when you look at its impact compared to past ones. Not quite as big as things like the HIV epidemic, as well as the Spanish flu pandemic. However, it is, of course, still not over in terms of COVID. So, but if you actually look at the death tolls, and this visual here is actually a little bit dated. It's from, I believe January or last December. But it shows kind of where these different pandemics over time have sort of rated in terms of their kinds of big impacts that they've had on societies in terms of numbers of deaths. So, for instance, bubonic plague, the Black Death, is, of course, one of the really big ones. And, of course, remember that the world's population was much smaller then than it is now. But, of course, COVID is still, in operation as we speak. But still, historically, it hasn't been as big as some of the others. But these different pandemics have had huge impacts on, if not necessarily what we might consider an apocalyptic event, certainly have had huge impacts on politics, economy, and culture. Okay, so in the face of different kinds of things like health crises, but also political and economic crises, what I want to focus on here in the last part of this is how do apocalyptic visions play into hopes and fears for the future? When people, when things aren't going your way, do people turn to apocalyptic visions promising fundamental or violent change? Well, the short answer to that is yes, of course they do. And so we definitely see this today. Now, some of these are religious in nature, right? They as we saw earlier in the semester, we saw how people talk about the different apocalyptic traditions in these different religions that they looked at. However, it's beyond that too. Like, well, first of all, this continued into the last couple centuries with things like the Millerites in the 1800s, who claimed that the apocalypse was about to happen right then and there. And then you have other smaller groups like the Branch Dravidians, who thought that there was going to be an apocalypse in Waco, Texas, back a few decades ago, and groups like Heaven's Gate, who think that they're going to get a ride on a comet by aliens hiding a spaceship behind a comet that's going to save them from the Earth's doom. So these kind of run the gambit of all sorts of different kinds of perspectives, some of them crazier than others. All right. And I should add, these claims have not necessarily, discredited these religions. The Millerites are still around. They're now the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so claims that, an apocalypse is impending, even when it doesn't happen, doesn't necessarily discredit the religion. But the thing that I really want to focus on here is the fact that we now have what we refer to as secular apocalypticism, which is that these ideas from religion have kind of transferred themselves into the political sphere, and that's what I want to talk about here now. Okay, so how does politics get affected today by these apocalyptic visions? Well, it happens in a lot of ways. So for one thing, you need to recognize that this happens on both the political left and the political right of the spectrum here in the United States. So for instance, on the political right, you have groups like QAnon that talk a lot about a kind of impending apocalypse, or sometimes referred to as the storm is coming, that sort of thing. The Boogaloo Boys, who believe that a civil war is imminent and that they should actually help start this sort of thing. And other kinds of apocalyptic fantasies on the kind of the political right. On the political left, however, there is a long history, too, of this idea that you have some sort of large, sweeping social change, usually referred to as the revolution, right, where afterwards all the different kind of corrupt aspects of the society are wiped away, and you replace it with the new Jerusalem of a new social order. And of course, it's not hard to see that these sort of visions of the left, even if they're not couched in religious terms, definitely draw from some of the apocalyptic narratives and philosophies that are from religious perspectives. The other thing that you might notice too is that there's a lot of apocalyptic imagery and discussions in the modern environmental movement as well. Ideas that if we don't change our ways and kind of treat the environment in a better and different way, that it's going to literally destroy the entire planet and will be the end of the world. And of course, I'm sure you've heard these sort of things. They are, in lots of different aspects of the environmental movement. Now, I should emphasize here, just because people are, borrowing from this apocalyptic imagery doesn't necessarily mean that they're totally wrong. However, it needs to be recognized where some of these ideas and imageries come from, right? Both the political left and the political right. And the thing to recognize is that they have these functions, right? It functions as a social critique, which is that if you don't change your behavior or political life, or if you don't see the changes in the environment, or on the political right, the changes in the demographic makeup of a country, that sort of thing, and the fears and crises around, immigration, that sort of thing. These things are portrayed as potentially apocalyptic, that this is something that is going to literally end kind of the society as they know it and usher in something either really awful or be an opportunity to kind of institute the new Jerusalem. And so there's this idea that, again, just sort of like we had that split between traditional apocalypse and neo-apocalypse, sometimes there's this vision of, you just sort of, within the case of like a neo-apocalypse, you just kind of avoid the disaster. Or in the case of the traditional story, there's this idea of the new Jerusalem, where you get rid of all your political opponents violently or through divine intervention or whatever it might be, and then you institute sort of this new world where just people who politically agree with you are left and everyone else is gone. Now, of course, this is really violent and excluding on both sides of the political spectrum, but B, it's also probably like, pretty, what's the right word? It's just unlikely, right? This is not necessarily how societies work. In terms of, this kind of idea of like a large cleanse where all of a sudden all your opponents are gone, doesn't tend to actually work and doesn't tend to be permanent. And we're going to get more into that next module in Module 11. But where we're going from here is sort of a little bit of a choose your own adventure in this module, in that you can take a look at either right-wing or left-wing views of sort of the apocalyptic imagery and how that kind of informs their political programs. Or, well, you're going to look at either or that, and then we're also going to look at economic collapse, because political revolution is, of course, one manifestation of sort of this idea of a world-ending kind of thing, but also concerns that the economy could completely kind of disintegrate or collapse is another aspect. And again, going back to the idea that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Yes, maybe there's some exaggeration in terms of the apocalyptic nature of what could happen with an economic collapse. However, it doesn't mean that the economy isn't very, very unstable, because it is. And that's something that we're going to talk about in some of these other videos, right? We're going to talk about how the fact that, the modern economy has always had a series of, kind of booms, and, the economy goes up and then the economy goes down, right? Booms and busts all over time. And we're going to talk about the current moment now, where we look back at the 2008 crisis and see kind of the instability within the system, as well as sort of the videos that talk about the overall instability. And then lastly, we'll talk about what's going on today. Inflation, rising interest rates, sky-high energy and food prices, right? The fracturing of the global economy back into competing blocks. All of these things make the economy more stable. So these are the sort of things that we're going to look at in the continuing readings, but that's it for now. And go ahead and watch the other videos, and I look forward to the discussions.